Running a Raspberry Pi without a desktop GUI is great if you're doing data collection. The desktop will slow things down and use memory, which in some cases is a problem. When you need remote access but don't want to launch VNC, SSH is the answer. Hi, I'm Mark Neiman Ross, and welcome to this week's edition of Raspberry Pi Weekly. Every week we explore the Raspberry Pi and share useful tips. SSH stands for Secure Shell and provides a secure way to remotely log on to a Raspberry Pi. It's really easy to set up. Open a terminal in Raspberry Pi and type sudo raspi-config. Go down to Interfacing Options and hit the Return key to select that. Then go down to SSH and again hit Return. Would you like the SSH server to be enabled? Why, yes, I would, and I'm using the arrow key to move back and forth between yes and no. When I've selected yes, I hit Return, and the SSH server is enabled. Now I can finish raspi-config. I'll go over to Finish and hit Return, and I am back at a terminal window. I'll need the IP address of the Raspberry Pi that I'm currently running on, and to get that, I can type in hostname, a dash, and a capital I. This gives me a list of all of the available IP addresses. You'll want to use the first one, and in my case, that's 10.35.3.111. Write that number down, and now you'll need an SSH client. To log on to your Raspberry Pi with SSH, you'll need an SSH client. I'm going to use the native Macintosh client, but there are others. To open up the Macintosh SSH client, I'll first open a terminal window. And then I'll open up a new remote connection. And in there, I'll type in SSH space Pi, which is the username for my Raspberry Pi, followed by an @ symbol, and then the address of the Raspberry Pi, which I got from hostname-I, and hit connect. Now let's make that full screen. I'll type in the password. And I'm now talking to the Raspberry Pi from a separate computer over SSH. I can run complete programs. For example, I can list the current directory. I can change directories. And I can run any Unix command that the Raspberry Pi allows me to get access to. When you're done, enter Control-D to close the SSH session. SSH is a great tool for remote access on your Raspberry Pi. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Raspberry Pi Weekly. Be sure to join the LinkedIn group and check out previous episodes on LinkedIn Learning. I'll see you next week with more Raspberry Pi adventures.